So last time, remember, we looked at the God calling Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, and we looked at the land of Moriah, particularly Mount Moriah, and where the temple eventually was constructed. And we looked at Isaac's obedience Abraham modeling the obedience to God, and then Isaac obeying both God and his father Abraham. And we saw that as a picture of Jesus' obedience to his father. And then we looked at God's provision of the ram and how that symbolizes Jesus as well, God's provision of the sacrificial lamb. And then we looked at the lessons that we might glean from this, lessons for Abraham, lessons for Isaac, and lessons for us. So at the end of that chapter, at the end of chapter 22, we get this piece that really belongs in chapter 23. Starting in verse 20, it says, "Now after these things it was told to Abraham, who knows by whom, Behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor, Uts, his firstborn, Buz, his secondborn, his brother, Kemuel, the father of Aram, Kesed, Hatzo, Pildash, Jidlaph, and Bethuel. Bethuel fathered Rebekah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. Moreover, his concubine, this is Nahor's concubine, whose name was Reumah, bore Tebah, Gaham, Tahash, and Maacah." So there are a lot of names here. For completeness' sake, I put the Hebrew in there and the meanings of the names. But really, there isn't much significance to these names except for a couple of them. Milcah, that name is found only here as indicating that she was Nahor's wife. Now, a lot of names in the Old Testament are reused, and we need to be aware of that when we're looking at these. For example, the firstborn there, Uts, shouldn't be confused with Shem's grandson, Uts, and also Job lived in the land of Uts. So those aren't the same Uzzes or Uzzes. Also, Nahor's grandson, Aram, shouldn't be confused with Shem's son, obviously, who was the one who became the forefather of the Syrians. It's interesting, Maacah is found as both a woman's name and as man's name. Maacah was also King Asa's mother and Caleb's concubine. Just in case, you ever needed to know, if you're ever on Jeopardy, and the final Jeopardy is, biblical Old Testament names, you'll be in good shape. Of all these names, the most important for our purposes are Bethuel and his daughter Rebekah. And of course, that's because Rebekah married Isaac and became the foremother of the line that eventually led to Jesus. Rebekah's name is interesting. It means ensnarer, which is quite apropos, as we'll soon see. One thing I did want to note, Nahor's son Kesed shouldn't be confused with the noun, the Hebrew noun chesed. You have to, when you speak Hebrew, you have to speak as if you got a big loogie in the back of your throat. Chesed means mercy, kindness, loving kindness, goodness. It's a great word study if you ever want to just do a word study. Chesed is a great word. And just as an aside here, this name Tahash means dugong. Well, I didn't know what a dugong was. A dugong is apparently a relative of the manatee that lives in the Indian Ocean, and in the Eastern Atlantic, Western Pacific.
Probably not related at all to the word in Hebrew.
Well, that his name means dugong. Tahash is the word in Hebrew. And, who knew? Well, apparently Sue knew. And apparently I wasn't the only one that didn't know. So continuing on then into verse 23, those are the only names in that list that are really important. Bethuel and Rebekah, for our purposes. I'm sure their names were important to them. So in verse 1 of chapter 23, Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah, and Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Now, there's not really a whole lot of point in going through this map. If we can even go through this map. Don't know why that's there. There we go. This is the northern Levant, this little notch here. If I can find my mouse, is the eastern part of Turkey. Right? So Turkey is up here. And of course, this is the eastern Mediterranean. Israel is way south of here. And remember when we talked about this, we talked about Abraham leaving Ur of the Chaldeans, and then he went to Canaan via Haran, right? Well, Haran is up here. Well, the reason he did that is because going straight across the desert is very, very hard. So this land, Paddan-Aram, which is translated as Mesopotamia in the ESV, in Hebrew is Aram Naharaim. It means Aran of the two rivers. Right? It's the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the so-called Fertile Crescent. These mountains up here are the mountains of Ararat. Right? So, not really anything else I wanted to say about this map. This is an interesting one. Aleppo. Right? Anybody ever heard of the Aleppo Codex? Prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was the oldest known manuscript of the Bible. It was sold in pieces, and the Israelis have the better part of it, but they don't have all of it. They bought up the chunks. It's in the Israel Museum. I've seen it. It's really cool, seeing the real thing. Antioch, right? The first place where people were called Christians, right? Tarsus, where Saul was from. Adana, Turkey, by the way, is where Incirlik Air Base is. Just in case you ever need to know. Ankara is the capital of Turkey, which is in northern central Turkey, up in here somewhere. So that's really all I wanted to say about that map. No other reason really for it to be there. Kiriath Arba was the original name for Hebron. Hebron was called Kiriath Arba until the conquest of Canaan by the Israelites. Now remember from our previous study that Abraham and Sarah had been living in the Negev, down around Beersheba, right? And even as far south as Kadesh. Evidently, in the meantime, they'd moved back to Hebron because that's where Sarah died. Although there's no place in the Bible where it mentions that move back northward. I thought it was interesting. This is the first mention of weeping and mourning in the Bible, which is kind of intriguing since we've seen Adam and Eve cast out of the garden. We've seen Abel getting murdered, right? We've seen the flood, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. This is the first time weeping and mourning is mentioned, which I thought was interesting. So continuing on in verse 3, and Abraham rose up from before his dead and said to the Hittites, and the Hittites were the sons of Heth, Noah's great-grandson from Ham through Canaan. Right? One of Canaan's sons was Heth, and the sons of Heth were called Hittites. In verse 4, he says, I am a sojourner and foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. The Hittites answered Abraham, Hear us, my lord. You are a prince of God, and that is Nasi Elohim, and we'll look at that in a minute. You're a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will withhold from you his tomb to hinder you from burying your dead. Now, Abraham, as we know, was very rich. He had lots of gold and silver and flocks and herds, but he didn't own any land in Canaan. He was a sojourner. He'd been in Canaan now for 60 years, apart from the very brief time when they fled to Egypt for the famine, fleeing from the famine, and he lied to Pharaoh about Sarai being his sister. Apart from that time, he'd been living in Canaan for 60 years, around Canaan, but he'd never settled down. He lived in tents. He was a sojourner.
And
A herdsman, a nomadic herdsman. This death of Sarah is the first person that we have reported in Abraham's family to die since he came from Haran 60 years before. This is also the first mention of the burial of the dead. Prior to this, as Carol pointed out last time, all the things that mention death say, he was gathered to his people, right? Or simply, he died, right? Doesn't say anything about what happened to the body. This is the first time we hear about burial of the body in Hebrew tradition. Now, this Nasi Elohim, which the ESV translates as Prince of God, almost all the other English language translations translate this as Mighty Prince. But I think the ESV gets it right because Nasi and Elohim are both nouns, right? Neither of them means mighty, right? Nasi means prince. Elohim means God, right? So you are a mighty prince of God. I think the ESV gets it correct and the other ones don't, but I'm no linguist. I thought it was interesting. Notice that the Hittites recognized that Abraham was a follower of God. That intrigued me. And we've been talking about this in church, right? Brian's messages have been talking about this. It reminded me of the story in Acts 4 where Peter and John had been called to testify before the Jewish elders. And it says that they recognized that Peter and John had been with Jesus. Right? That's the way it should be with us. Everybody should recognize that we're with Jesus. Anyway, so in verse 7 it says, Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites. This I think is just hilarious. You have to kind of read it in a particular way. Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites, the people of the land, and he said to them, If you are willing that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me, and entreat for me Ephron, the son of Zohar, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns. It is at the end of his field. For the full price, let him give it to me in your presence as property for a burying place. Now Ephron was sitting among the Hittites, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the Hittites, of all who went in at the gate of his city, No, my lord, hear me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. In the sight of the sons of my people, I give it to you. Bury your dead. Then Abraham bowed down before the people of the land and he said to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, But if you will hear me, I give you the price of the field. Accept it from me that I may bury my dead there. Ephraim answered, said, My lord, listen to me. A piece of land that's worth 400 shekels. What is that? Let's see. Of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead. Abraham listened to Ephron, and Abraham weighed out for Ephron the silver that he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver according to the weights current among the merchants. And that, by the way, is about 10 pounds of silver. So I don't know what silver's worth these days, but quite a bit of scratch. But I just thought this sort of formalized courtesy was hilarious, right? Ephron was sitting right there. Abraham surely knew it, but when he first started, he's talking as if he wasn't there, right? And then you can just imagine that when Ephron spoke up, he taking the bait, right?
That's a formalized bartering.
It goes on today in the Middle East. It's still very common. You know, the very false humility, self-deprecation. You know, the I don't know. It's just I just thought it was funny. And then, you know, of course, Ephron knew exactly what he wanted for it, right? But he pretended not to want anything for it. And then Abraham made sure that when he paid for it, there were lots of witnesses, so there wouldn't be any, you know, he said, she said later. And I thought it was very, very interesting. The writer of Genesis knew exactly what that number was, right? Remember, when Genesis was written, Abraham didn't own that cave anymore, right? Because when they went down to Egypt, the last person buried in that cave was Jacob in the Bible. Anyway, so in verse 17, so the field of Ephron in Machpelah, and by the way, I didn't say it, but that Machpelah means double or portion, which was to the east of Mamre, the field with the cave that was in it, and all the trees that were in the field throughout its whole area, was made over to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the Hittites before all who went in at the gate of his city. After this, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah east of Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. The field and the cave that is in it were made over to Abraham as property for a burying place for the Hittites. Okay, we got it. Right? They said it 3 times, right? This cave continued to be used as a burial place for Abraham's descendants until the time of that Jacob went down to Egypt. And after that, that was the last one that was buried there. Today, the cave is still there. It's in Hebron, and it's called the Cave of the Patriarchs. A building was constructed over it by the Herodians, a dirt ugly building, just basically a cube. And then later, a Christian basilica was built on the site. And then when the Turks, I guess the Turks, or maybe the southern Arabians, when they took over Canaan, they made it into a mosque. And then when the Crusaders came back in, they made it back into a church. And then when the Turks whooped the Crusaders and kicked them out, then they made it back into a mosque. And then in 1967, when the Jews took back the West Bank, right, including Hebron, they made it into a divided space, half synagogue, half mosque, right? And it's been the site of a lot of violence, including in 1994, the so-called Cave of the Patriarchs massacre. An IDF soldier went into the mosque and opened fire, killed 29 and wounded 125. Anytime somebody sneezes in the wrong direction at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, there are Molotov cocktails flying everywhere and rocks, and it's just, I don't know. You know what the Cave of the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is? In Jerusalem. It's the site that the Catholics say is where Golgotha was. There is a 1,000-page document called the Status Quo that governs who may do what, when, inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. All right. It was signed in the 1890s. Well, when they signed the Status Quo, someone was working on one of the second floor windows, and they had a ladder there. The ladder is still there because the status quo doesn't define what can be done with it. Right? It's it's crazy. Then in chapter 24, and yeah, we may be okay. In verse 1, it says, "Now Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had, Put your hand under my thigh, that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell, but will go to my country and to my kindred and take a wife for my son Isaac." So this strange custom of putting the hand under the thigh to swear, evidently it was a tradition of the ancient Hebrews. The only other place we find it in the Bible is Jacob made Joseph swear that he wouldn't bury him in Egypt. The same way, he said, "Put your hand under my thigh and swear you won't bury me in Egypt." We'll get to that hopefully in Genesis 47. So this intermarriage with the Canaanites, when God gave the law to Moses, he forbade them to intermarry with the peoples of the lands that they were going to conquer, or partially conquer, including the Canaanites. Lots of Hebrews have since then disobeyed that command, including Samson, who was a judge of Israel. But although this prohibition hadn't yet been formalized in the law, Abraham clearly didn't want Isaac to have a Canaanite wife. He says so right here. But why? Possibly Abraham, or probably I would say, Abraham recognized the danger that Isaac would be drawn into the idolatry of the Canaanites. Remember, we talked about some of those ites had some pretty horrendous worship ceremonies involving child sacrifice and the like. So Abraham was probably worried that Isaac might fall into that. And sure enough, the Israelites fell into idolatry in various ways, including the worship of Molech under King Solomon, because Solomon had all those wives and porcupines, and they fell into idolatry. He actually constructed facilities for them to do their idolatrous ceremonies. What Abraham probably didn't know was that his family in Paddan-Aram had already fallen into idolatry. At least we know that they had household gods by the time Abraham's grandson came back from Paddan-Aram some years later, because Jacob's wife Rachel stole her father's household gods. We'll get into that in Genesis 31.
And maybe it also was the custom to intermarry with your own people, because Sarah was Abraham's sister.
Or so he said. Possibly was. Who am I to say? Can't prove that he didn't lie, or that he did lie. So, and just in general, birds of a feather flock together. It's a fact even today. So in verse 5, the servant said to him, "Perhaps the woman may not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came?" Abraham said to him, "See to it that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my kindred, and who spoke to me and swore to me, 'To your offspring I will give this land,' he will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this oath of mine. Only you must not take my son back there." So the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham his master and swore to him concerning this matter. Then the servant took 10 of his master's camels and departed, taking all sorts of choice gifts from his master, and he arose and went to Mesopotamia. And we looked at that already. In Hebrew, that's Aran Naharayim, Aram of the two rivers, to the city of Nahor. And of course, the city of Nahor was Haran. Now, this journey from Hebron to Haran is about 500 miles. So it would have taken this guy 20 to 30 days by camel to get up there. And the return journey would have been even longer because we'll find out Isaac was living down in the Negev. He was living in Be'er Lahai Roi by that time, which is in the southern Negev, northern Sinai. Why was Abraham so adamant that the servant not take Isaac to Paddan-Aram?
Because God told him that was his land, the other was his land, and he took God at his word for that, I guess?
Yeah, he says it right here. God promised to give this land, the land of Canaan, to my descendants. Remember, when God first called Abraham, he called him from Paddan-Aram, or Haran, the city of Haran, and he obeyed. And maybe Abraham thought that Isaac going back there would have been tantamount to disobedience, right? And of course, God couldn't fulfill his promise to give Abraham's descendants, give Canaan to Abraham's descendants, if they weren't living there. So God couldn't have allowed Isaac to stay in Paddan-Aram, not if he was going to give them Canaan instead. Anyway, so in verse 11, and he made the camels kneel down outside the city by the well of water at the time of evening, the time when women go out to draw water. And he said, O Lord God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show steadfast love to my master Abraham. By the way, that steadfast love is chesed. Right? Behold, I'm standing by the spring of water, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Let the young woman to whom I shall say, please let down your jar that I may drink, and who shall say, drink, and I will water your camels, let her be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac. By this I shall know that you have shown steadfast love, and that's chesed again, to my master. This prayer is very specific, right? Specific request for specific signs. And it's reminiscent of Gideon's prayers. Remember when the Midianites and the Amalekites were oppressing Israel, and God called Gideon, who was hiding in a wine press, if I remember right, when God called him. And Gideon asked God to show him signs that he was truly behind this going up against the Amalekites and the Midianites. And the way that Gideon did that is now, it's come to be known as casting a fleece. So I'm going to cast a fleece because Gideon, that's the way Gideon couched his prayers, right? Well, let me put this fleece out, and, if it's, I can't remember exactly what it was. Part of it was covered and part of it wasn't or something. And he wanted the part that was covered to be dry. And anyway, I can't remember. But then he did it again, right? And this time he did it the opposite. He wanted the dew to be on one fleece and not on the other. Anyway, it's called casting a fleece, casting out a fleece now because of the way Gideon did it. The question is it okay for us to do? All right. The reason I ask that is it all goes back to a story that happened during the wilderness wandering. The Israelites came to a place and they were thirsty. They didn't have any water, and they were, complaining to Moses about it. And God told Moses to whack this rock with his staff, and water came out. But Moses named the place Massa, which means temptation, and Meribah, which means strife or contention. And then later on in Deuteronomy 6:16, God commanded, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test as you tested him at Massa. And then when Satan was tempting Jesus, he said, he took him to the highest part of the temple, the pinnacle of the temple, and said, throw yourself over. If you really are the Son of God, God will, you won't die, basically, by falling off the temple. And Jesus' response was, you shall not. He quoted this Deuteronomy 6:16. So it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. So the question is, when we make specific requests like that for signs, are we disobeying this commandment not to put the Lord our God to the test?
It depends on your heart.
That's what I think too. I think it all depends on our motivations for asking for these
I was
signs.
just going to say, motive is everything.
Yep.
And
In-
do we
in
want,
a- in
do
any
we
way.
want clarity so
Yeah.
that we can step out in faith and follow the Lord the way He would have us follow Him? Or are we just,
Well, it's like what we were talking about last night. We're going to bring it out, present it this way,
Mm-hmm.
go that far from now.
Mm-hmm.
Then we're going to continue. Well, aren't we doing the same thing?
Yes.
So,
Well, that's
yeah.
that's what I said. All depends on our motivations.
But I mean, it's not
Whether it's really wrong or not, it depends on what our motivations are. And God knows what our motivations are. Right? And I said here, God will not despise a truly humble and contrite heart. Right? And furthermore, His word will never come back to Him without accomplishing the purpose for which He sent it forth. So when we make specific requests, like the servant did here, God will sometimes give us specific answers. And the example that came to me was when we were young believers, really only a couple of years old. Well, when was it? 2002. 2000 to 2002, just a couple of years old. We felt that we were called to leave Tucson, which is where a good part of my family was living at the time, and move to Aiken, South Carolina. And we felt that we were called to do that, to join a specific church in Aiken, South Carolina. And so, like I said, I was a new believer at the time, and I had recently read for the first time this story about Gideon, right? So I'm standing in the line at the U-Haul place to rent the truck, and I was praying, Lord, give me some sign that this is actually your will for us to do this. And my prayer wasn't as specific as Abraham's servant was, right? But his answer was just as immediate. And God's answer to Abraham's servant was what he needed for his reassurance. God's answer to me was what I needed for my reassurance. It was immediate, but it wasn't as specific as with Abraham's servant. Well, I'll give you the rest of the story in a minute. Yes. And now, the rest of the story. So in verse 15, before he had finished speaking, behold, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, came out with her water jar on her shoulder. And if you have the scorecard and you're following along, it means that Rebekah was Abraham's grandniece, right? Not the son. Anyway, one generation down from being a niece. The young woman was very attractive in appearance, a maiden whom no man had known. She went down to the spring and filled her jar and came up. The servant then ran to meet her and said, "Please give me a little water to drink from your jar." She said, "Drink, my lord." And she quickly let down her jar upon her hand and gave him a drink. When she had finished giving him a drink, she said, "I will draw water for your camels also, until they have finished drinking." So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough and ran again to the well to draw water, and she drew for all his camels. That's a lot of water, 10 camels that have been, who knows how long it was the last time they drank. The man gazed at her in silence to learn whether the Lord had prospered his journey or not. When the camels had finished drinking, the man took a gold ring weighing about half a shekel, That's about 1/5 of an ounce. And 2 bracelets for her arms weighing 10 gold shekels. That's about 4 ounces. And said, please tell me whose daughter you are. Is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night? She said to him, I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor. She added, we have plenty of both straw and fodder and room to spend the night. The man bowed his head and worshipped the Lord and said, blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness toward my master. As for me, the Lord has led me in the way to the house of my master's kinsman. So God's specific answer and immediate answer was as specific as the prayer. It was exactly what the servant needed. Let's see. And sometimes God gives us specific and immediate responses when he knows that we need them in order to press forward with what he's already determined. Right? We talked about that sort of thing in the Experiencing God study, right? God has already determined to do something. He's inviting you to join him in it, right? Anyway, my prayer at the U-Haul place had just been for a general sign, nothing nearly as specific, but he gave me a response that was as specific as I needed to continue to obey his will. Now, I wanted to just make a brief side trip here as a word of warning. It's very tempting for us to take this answer to this specific prayer as a proof text of this blasphemous, evil-spirited prosperity gospel that's being promulgated throughout the Christendom, particularly Western Christendom. These charlatans that are proclaiming this blab it and grab it gospel, they're preying on people's selfishness and their greed and their poverty and their desperation and their gullibility by misusing Scripture. Scripture like Matthew 21:22, whatever you ask in prayer you will receive if you have faith. Right? And then when the victims take the bait, right, then they reveal their true colors. Right? Misusing another scripture or other scriptures like it to get their victims to sow financially into their ministries. Right? Luke 6:38 says, "Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For with the measure that you use, will it be measured back to you." Right? And then, in the frequent case when God does not give the people their selfish desires, then these guys, right, they say, well, you didn't have enough faith, or maybe you didn't sow enough seed into my ministry, right? Right, and I put ministry there in quotes, by the way. Right. What does the word ministry mean? It means service. You minister to people, right? Anyway, this spiritual abuse of weak and gullible people has shipwrecked many a person's faith. Even worse, many people actually, have misplaced their trust in the healing powers of some of these guys, or the so-called healing powers, and eschewed other treatments as a result, right? Because they're trusting in these guys to heal them and turning down other options, right? Which, of course, makes their families desperate. But probably the worst of all is other people, third parties, see this going on, recognize the falsity of the prosperity gospel, and they infer that the real gospel, the true gospel, is also false. So these guys are actually putting people in eternal danger. But I'll get down off that soapbox now.
Finish the U-Haul story.
Yeah, no, we will. The true lesson that we can glean from yep. Yeah, that's right. You got to get at the rest of the story. The lesson we can glean from this prayer and God's immediate response is that the servant was asking within the will of what God had already determined for him. Right? He only needed guidance and reassurance. Jesus says, when he says, whatever you ask in my name, this I will do, that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If you ask me anything in my name, I will do it, which is another one of those ones that they misuse. When he says in my name, he doesn't mean that we just need to, tack in Jesus' name on the end of our prayer, right? What he means is we need to ask within his will. And when he says that he'll give us what we desire, well, he doesn't say that here. He says it in another verse, but when he says that he'll give you what you desire, it's because he'll make what you desire what he desires, right? By the power of his Spirit dwelling within you. Did I skip it? I may have skipped it. So I'll go back.
Just a comment too, because there's going to be a lot of women coming to the well for the water.
Mm-hmm.
He needed more specificity to be able to determine if that was the right one. So you kind of look at the bigger picture and say, suppose 50 women came out, and they're all just custom going to offer water because that's what they do. So I mean, he almost had to get specific in order for God's will to be able to be revealed to him.
And that was the point I was making. His answer is as specific as we need, right? He knows what we need in order to accomplish what he wants us to do, right? He knows how much he needs to share with us. You guys know my one of my favorite verses. Jesus was about to be hauled away to be killed, and he said, "I have much more to tell you, but you can't hear it right now." Right? When he was talking about the Spirit coming, he will guide you into all truth. He gives us what we need to press forward with what he has determined.
That's the thing, like Jesus appearing to Paul on the road to Damascus.
Mm-hmm.
He said, "Wow, I'd like for God to appear to me like that," or whatever. But look at what God was calling him to.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing about people. When God gives a dramatic call on somebody's life, it is to something that is such that they need that memory to carry them through the trials. So don't wish for a dramatic appearance of God calling you into something, because if he does, that means it's not going to be an easy.
Well, that's like the story when James and John put their mother up to asking him if they could sit on his right and left.
Jewish mother wanted the most for her children.
Actually, there are two versions of that, and one of them they ask themselves. But anyway, when they asked to be at his right and his left, and he said, "You don't know what you're asking," right? What did he say? "Can you drink the cup that I'm going to drink? And indeed, you will drink it. But to sit at my right and my left hand, you don't know what you're asking. It's for the ones that my Father has appointed." Yep. So I did skip it, actually. My question to God, just show me some sign that I'm acting in accordance with your will, wasn't nearly as specific as the servant's was, right? But his answer was just as immediate, and it was exactly what I needed. I got to the front of the counter, or got to the front of the line, and I said, "I need your biggest one way to Aiken, South Carolina, with a car hauler trailer behind it." And the guy behind me in line said, "Oh, Aiken? I'm from Aiken." Right? So that was what I needed at the time to be assured that we were doing the right thing. And it's funny, that church, we joined that church that year along with 3 other couples that had moved from Philadelphia, South Florida, and I always forget the last was the Shorts. The Hermans, they came from Florida. Us.
And the Prizzy Bees.
The Prizzy Bees.
So is that a Calvary Chapel?
It was Calvary Chapel, Aiken. Presbylowics, the Presbylowics came from Baltimore down to Aiken to join that church. Anyway, and you would think that church would...
So why did you feel called to move and go to that church?
The month before, or maybe 2 months before, I had been teaching at Fort Gordon, which is in Augusta, Georgia, across the river from Aiken. And my tradition, I guess you would say, or my habit at the time was whenever I went to go teach somewhere, I would look up the nearest Calvary Chapel and go there for the time that I was there. The nearest one at the time, there was actually, later on, there was a Calvary in Augusta, but the nearest one at the time I went there was in Aiken. And so I went there, and the first day I was there, Rachel and Jim just wrapped around me. And, I was their charge, right? I was their child for the time that I was there. For those few weeks that I was there, it might have been 6 weeks. And everybody, it was, Nate said this. When the pastor said the church was over, everybody hung around. They might have hung around for an hour, right? It wasn't like everybody's, we got to get down to the Waffle House, or whatever. They truly enjoyed being with each other, and they treated me like I was one of them from the very instant I walked into place. I didn't know this at the time, but the way they did church there was they had a time of worship, and then they had a time of prayer and thanksgiving. And if that time of prayer and thanksgiving was over by 11:30 or so, then Pastor Bob preached. Otherwise, he didn't. Right? The time of prayer was the important part. And that was the way I wanted to be in church. The guy that baptized me in Tucson couldn't pull me out of a lineup to save his mother's life. Not to say anything bad about him. I mean, the church had, 5 services? Well, 3 services on the east and 2 services on the west every Sunday. And each of those services had, 300-400 people in it. I learned a lot there. Robert Furrow was a great Bible teacher, or is a great Bible teacher. But it was not a family like Calvary Aiken was. And I wanted to be part of that. So, anyway. So, let's see, where were we at? In verse 28, the young woman ran and told her mother's household about these things. Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban, or Laban, most people would say, which means white. Laban ran out toward the man to the spring as soon as he saw the ring and the bracelets on his sister's arm. And heard the words of Rebekah, his sister. Thus the man spoke to me. He went to the man, and behold, he was standing by the camels at the spring. He said, "Come in, O blessed of the Lord. Why do you stand outside? For I have prepared the house and a place for the camels." So the man came to the house and unharnessed the camels and gave straw and fodder to the camels. And there was water to wash his feet and the feet of the men who were with him. Then food was set before him to eat, but he said, I will not eat until I have said what I have to say. And he said, this is Laban, said, speak on. Now, Laban, this is our first acquaintance with him. What we're going to find out is this guy was a guy who had a keen eye for the main chance, as they say in England. This was Jacob's, Abraham's grandson's, future father-in-law. And, he saw the jewelry on his sister's arm, and by the way, that would have been worth 4 ounces of gold. If there were 4 ounces of gold each, would have been worth about $20,000 today. That's not the kind of gift that you give to a casual acquaintance because she gave you a drink of water at the well. Obviously Laban knew that there was something going on here, and he was hoping there was more where that came from. Right. So in verse 34, so he said, and this is Abraham's servant speaking. I'm not going to go too deeply into this, but I will read it just for completeness sake, because it's repetition of what we've already read. In verse 34, so he said, I am Abraham's servant. The Lord has greatly blessed my master and has become great. He has given him flocks and herds, silver and gold, male servants and female servants, camels and donkeys. And Sarah, my master's wife, bore a son to my master when she was old, and to him he has given all that he has. My master has made me swear, saying, you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites in whose land I dwell, but you shall go to my father's house and to my clan and take a wife for my son. I said to my master, perhaps the woman will not follow me. But he said to me, the Lord before whom I have walked will send his angel with you and prosper your way. Prosper your way. You shall take a wife for my son from my clan and from my father's house. Then you will be free from my oath when you come to my clan. And if you will, Then you will be free from my oath when you come to my clan. And if they will not give her to you, you will be free from my oath. I came today to the spring and said, O Lord, the God of my master Abraham, if now you are prospering the way that I go, behold, I am standing by the spring of water. Let the virgin who comes out to draw water, to whom I shall say, please give me a little water from your jar to drink, and who will say to me, drink, and I will draw for your camels also, let her be the woman whom the Lord has appointed for my master's son. Before I had finished speaking in my heart, behold, Rebekah came out with her water jar on her shoulder, and she went down to the spring and drew water. I said to her, please let me drink. She quickly let down her jar from her shoulder and said, drink, and I will give your camels drink also. So I drank, and she gave the camels drink also. Then I asked her, whose daughter are you? She said, the daughter of Bethuel, Nahor's son, whom Milcah bore to him. So I put the ring on her nose and the bracelets on her arms. Then I bowed my head and worshipped the Lord and blessed the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who had led me by the right way to take the daughter of my master's kinsman for his son. Now then, if you are going to show steadfast love, and that's chesed again, and faithfulness to my master, tell me, and if not, tell me, that I may turn to the right hand or to the left. And, if he wasn't hungry before, he was certainly hungry by the time he finished that, right? This is just about a word-for-word repetition of what we read so far. Just note the complete obedience of the servant to his master and his devotion to God. And notice the truthfulness and completeness of his testimony. He didn't have an agenda that he was working with Rebekah's father here, or with her family. So in verse 30, then Laban and Bethuel answered and said, the thing has come from the Lord. We cannot speak to you bad or good. Behold, Rebekah is before you. Take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken. When Abraham's servant heard their words, he bowed himself to the earth before the Lord. And the servant brought out jewelry of silver and of gold and garments and gave them to Rebekah. He also gave to her brother and to her mother costly ornaments, and he and the men who were with him ate and drank, and they spent the night there. When they arose in the morning, he said, send me away to my master. Now, we're going to find out Laban was a conniver and a deceiver, and his primary motivation was his own gain. But here in this passage, He and his father got one thing right. Right? What did they say? The thing has come from the Lord. We cannot speak to you bad or good. Right? At least they got that right. They recognize that God is in control. He's sovereign in all things. And they could tell from this servant's truthful and complete testimony that this was indeed God's will.
This guy appears out of nowhere. Since he's sent to get their daughter for his master's son, and the next day he leaves with her.
Yep. That didn't keep him from trying to negotiate a little bit, as we'll see here. But they recognized a move of God when they saw it, is the whole point. This reminded me of Gamaliel. John and Peter had been hauled before the council of Jewish elders, the Sanhedrin, and for preaching in the name of Jesus. By the way, Gamaliel was Saul of Tarsus's teacher. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, and most of them wanted to kill Peter and John over this, but he asked that they be taken out so he could speak. In Acts 5, verse 38, he said, in the present case, and this is just a little bit of what he said, in the present case, I tell you, keep away from these men and let them alone, for if this plan or this undertaking is of man, it will fail. But if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. You might even be found opposing God. Now, just something that's not written here, but it struck me. Everybody involved here. The writer of the book, the human participants in the story, the readers, us, Rebekah, and dare I say it, God himself, all assumed, without mentioning it, that Rebekah had absolutely no choice in this matter. All right? Nobody asked her. And furthermore, Isaac didn't have any choice. Right?
Arranged marriages.
This is the first explicit case in the Bible where we see this tradition of prearranged marriage. Often this was done for children. Marriages were arranged, and it's continued. I mean, if you look at the history of the royal families of Europe, practically all of their marriages were for political purposes. Right? We're not told about this tradition. We're not told how any of the marriages that have been mentioned so far after Adam and Eve came about, except for, Cain knew his wife, who was also his sister, right? We're not told how these things came about. And furthermore, wives in general are very rarely mentioned at all. And when they are mentioned, they're mentioned in the genealogies. And they're sometimes mentioned in other cases, not just wives, but women in general, when they're important to the story itself. Deborah springs to mind, right? Watch out, he'll try to suckle on you if you let him. He probably thinks your button is a nipple.
Also, think about the gold, the money, right? Because God didn't tell him to offer money, to put the money out there. He put the money out there, and they saw the money like, okay, was that the motivation? In other words, with no money, would that have transpired the way it did? Mm-hmm. Because it almost, the way the writer wrote this, almost makes us think that the money was the driving issue.
Well, it certainly was for Laban, and you notice that Bethuel doesn't say anything. Apparently, Laban had been Bethuel's spokesman for a while. Who knows how old Bethuel was by this time?
But I wonder if that was part of the tradition. In other words,
yep.
Well, when Jacob went to Laban, he didn't have any gold. He had worked for 7 years.
Right.
And he got the wrong wife.
Yeah, he was there for 20 years all total. These arranged marriages, a lot of it has to do with the bride price, right? And by the way, the purpose of the bride price was the father was supposed to keep the bride price or the dowry in trust in case the daughter came back, right? Because the new husband died, or put her away, as it says, the euphemism that they use. Apparently, though, this tradition of prearranged marriage was already well established by Abraham's time.
I think even in the Jewish culture today, they have their like matchmakers and
The ultra orthodox for sure do. I think I may have told you the story about Ronnie. If you are an Israeli citizen, Jewish or not, and you want to get married in Israel, you must be married by a rabbi. That's the law. And you can only be married by a rabbi if you're Jewish. And you're only Jewish if your mother was Jewish or your grandmother was Jewish, provably. Well, what we don't think about, one of the victims of the Holocaust was the records. They burned the synagogues. That's where the marriages and the births and the deaths were kept. And Ronnie's mother and father were both the sole survivors of their families. I don't know how they met. They met after the war, but they were both the only survivors of the Holocaust in their families. They had no proof whatsoever that they were Jewish, but then they were Romanian, and after 9 years trying to get from Romania to Eretz Israel, to the new Israel, they finally got an exit visa and got to go to Israel. Well, they brought Ronnie along. I think he was 5 at the time when they moved, when they immigrated. And, later on, he wanted to get married. Well, in order to get married, he had to prove that his mother was Jewish, right? So his mother's sitting in this place with the rabbi. Have I already told you this story?
Yeah, you did once.
And the rabbi says, well, Elizabeth, that's not a Jewish name. Of course, ignoring John the Baptist's mother, right? Who they don't believe in anyway. And she says, well, Elizabeth is my middle name. Rachel is my first name. And Rachel is most certainly a Jewish name. Right? And he points to Ronnie and he says, Ronnie, that's not a Jewish name. She says, well, it's short for Aaron, which is most certainly a Jewish name. And Ronnie said he looked down his glasses at her, the rabbi did, and said, are you sure you're Jewish, ma'am? And she said, well, I've been called a filthy Jew my whole life, but I guess that's not good enough in the state of Israel. Anyway, I don't know why I got off on that. It's a funny story, though. And apparently Ronnie's father found some scrap of paper that was good enough for this guy, and he managed to get married. A lot of Jews, though, go to places like Cyprus or Crete, or I don't think they would go to Egypt to get married, and then they come back. But yeah, the ultra-Orthodox.
Suppose it's Jews.
wouldn't circumcision mean that he was most likely Jewish? Because they're the only ones at that time that were really
Well,
circumcising here.
I don't want to share too much, but I'm not Jewish, and I'll just leave it at that.
Well, but at that time.
Yeah, but then.
Much, honey.
Yeah,
Let's finish your lesson.
we won't make any
They
more.
think that the Poles would turn over Jewish boys by showing that they were circumcised as Nazis. So it wasn't the thing in Eastern Europe to do that. So
Yeah, that would work for the boys too, but not for the girls, obviously. So, and it's interesting. You are Jewish if your mother was Jewish or your grandmother was Jewish. Your father is irrelevant. Their reason.
Your mother.
Hmm?
Yep, your mother's your mother.
Well, that's right. The reasoning
There's
is,
a question about who your father is.
but not your mother. Yeah. And your mother shall bear witness, I'm sure, because of what she had to go through to have you. Anyway, so Rachel didn't really have a choice in this. Rebecca. Neither did Rachel, by the way. So in verse, and by the way, the reason I'm intrigued by this is because I believe that my marriage was ordained by my father, just not by my parents, if that makes any sense. Anyway, in verse 55, her brother and her mother said, "Let the young woman remain with us a while." Remember, he said, "Send me away to my master." And then in verse 55, her brother and her mother said, "Let the young woman remain with us a while, at least 10 days. After that she may go." But he said to them, "Do not delay me, since the Lord has prospered my way. Send me away that I may go to my master." They said, "Let us call the young woman and ask her." And they called Rebekah and said to her, "Will you go with this man?" She said, "I will go." So they sent away Rebekah, their sister, and her nurse, and Abraham's servant and his men, and they blessed Rebekah and said to her, "Our sister, may you become thousands of 10,000s." And that word 10,000s is rababa, and that means 10,000s or multitudes. "And may your offspring possess the gate of those who hate him." Then Rebekah and her young women arose and rode on the camels and followed the man. Thus the servant took Rebekah and went his way. So Rebekah didn't have any power to say whether she was going to go, but apparently they granted her the power to say when she was going to go, right? They asked her, "Well, let's ask the young woman, if she wants to go now or wait for 10 days, right?" She was going to go, right? No doubt about that.
They asked her if she wanted to go.
Yes, but it was in when they wanted to delay it. They'd already said that he should take her. It's not right. It's this is of God, right?
I was thinking 10 days, a little bit of gold every day.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking they're hoping to negotiate a little bit better bride price.
You still got a little bag there. I want to see what's in it.
And the other thing that occurred to me was, you guys have seen the map. The prospect of staying there in Mesopotamia for a few more days, land between the rivers and staying as a guest in their house, and might have seemed a little bit more attractive to the servant than a 30-day journey by camel to the Negev. Right? Yep. But anyway, in verse 5, it says, his obedience, his willingness to carry forward with his mission reminded me of what Paul said in Philippians 2. In verse 5, he says, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped or held on to, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross." He had determined, this servant had determined to carry out his mission. And just the way Jesus determined to carry out his mission. And it was, first of all, he had to abandon his glory temporarily. Abandon being in the presence of his Father, and then go to the cross. He said it in Gethsemane, "If there's any way apart from this, yet not my will, but your will be done." Now, just as an aside here, they said, may you become thousands of 10,000s. 10,000 is the largest number that can be expressed in ancient Hebrew as a word. So that's why they said thousands of 10,000s instead of 10 millions. Right? When it says million, like in, let's see, Chronicles, 2 Chronicles 22, it talks about 1 million men in an army. And then in 2 Chronicles 14, it talks about 1,000,000 talents of gold. That's a lot of gold. But if the Hebrew there is thousand, it just takes the word for thousand and repeats it twice. So now you know that. That's just another one of those important things to know. Almost done here. So in verse 62, it says, Now Isaac had returned from Be'er Lahai Roi and was dwelling in the Negeb. And Isaac went out to meditate in the field toward evening, and he lifted up his eyes and saw, and behold, there were camels coming. And Rebekah lifted up her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she dismounted from the camel, and don't worry, Sue, I'm not going to tell the joke, and said to the servant, Who is that man walking in the field to meet us? The servant said, It is my master. So she took her veil and covered herself, and the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Then Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah his mother, and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So I thought it was kind of ironic that Isaac was living in Be'er Lahai Roi. Anybody remember? That was where God rescued Hagar and Ishmael after she had run away from Sarah when she found out she was pregnant and Sarah wasn't. Remember that? So I thought it was kind of ironic that then Sarah got pregnant and her son was living in Be'er Lahai Roi. Now, it may be confusing that Rebekah put on her veil when she saw Isaac, but she'd been riding apparently without the veil with Abraham's servant and his men all this time. Well, the veil wasn't a symbol of modesty like it is in the Muslim world today and in some other cultures. The veil was a sign of betrothal. She would have worn this veil until they were married, whenever she was with Isaac. And it's kind of similar to we kind of do that symbolically with the garter that brides wear, that they toss out and all that stuff. Some people do anyway. It's symbolic of the betrothal. So next time we'll see Abraham dies finally after 6 chapters, 7 chapters, 12 to 24, 12 chapters. 25 really, 13 chapters. And we'll look at the descendants of Ishmael. Remember, God had said that 12 princes would come from Ishmael, so we'll look at that. We'll look at his death. And finally, we'll look at the birth of the twins, Jacob and Esau. With the birth of those twins, we'll enter into the third part of Genesis. Remember when we first took up this study, we talked about there are like 5 major sections of Genesis. Well, the story of Jacob and Esau is the third part. Is it the third part or the fourth part? It's the fourth part. And then the final part will be the story about Joseph, right? Jacob's son.